Living in North America is easy to assume that e-commerce transactions happen the same all around the world. That's actually not true. There are drastic differences between how e-commerce transactions happen in Europe and how they happen in North America and how they happen in other places in the world. Today, we're going to talk about the differences in regards to consumer liability by diving into a technology called 3DS. First things first, let's walk through the typical e-commerce payments flow. We have the consumer over here. This consumer works with an issuer to get a credit card or a debit card. This consumer can then share that information to a merchant online. This is an e-commerce situation. Then the merchant shares that card information over to a PSP, which we've talked about in the past. And the PSP shares it over to the network, also called the scheme in some parts of the world. And the network or the scheme sends it back to the issuer so that they can validate the transaction. This is a very standard card payment. In this situation, if the merchant is only collecting the card details from the consumer and they're sending it through to the issuer, the merchant is taking on the liability for that transaction. What that means is that the consumer can call up their issuer and say, that wasn't me who made that payment. In that situation, the issuer issues a chargeback, and then this ends with you getting your money back in your account, and then the merchant being out that money and potentially also the goods. Because you may have gone online and purchased a bicycle, and then after the merchant ships the bicycle to you, or ships the bicycle to someone, the issuer gets the chargeback, and then the merchant has to pay back that money, and they're out the bicycle. This is a standard process in North America, as we were discussing, because they are prioritizing getting that transaction. There is often very little validation on the front end of who that consumer is. Not all the time, but often. In many markets in the world, this flow is slightly different because there is a validation step of who the consumer is before that transaction can be made. That validation step is called 3DS. And 3DS stands for 3 domains secure. The 3 domains stand for the 3 different groups who are validating that this person is who they say they are. That is going to be the consumer, the merchant, and the issuer. All of these 3 have to agree that this person is who they say they are, that it is in fact their card before the payment can be made. There are 2 main types of 3DS. One is the frictionless flow, also called the data-only flow. The other is called the challenge flow or the friction flow. First, we're going to dive into the frictionless flow. In a frictionless flow, the consumer's device, so that's going to be the laptop or their phone, is going to provide information to the merchant that the merchant can then share with the 3DS vendor or the 3DS provider, who can then validate that with the issuer. An example of this is if I'm always making a payment from my hometown with my Google Pixel, then that information, the IP address, the Google Pixel information, all the information about me as a consumer is going to be shared with the merchant. The merchant can then share it over to the 3DS provider, who can then share it over to the issuer. And then the issuer can say, yes, that is typically the device that Travis is operating on. And then the merchant can go ahead and complete that transaction. Very, very common flow. That's frictionless. In the challenge flow, it's slightly different because it requires customer engagement. So the consumer submits their information over to the merchant. The merchant then sends their information to the 3DS provider. The 3DS provider goes out to the issuer, and then the issuer will prompt the consumer, and the consumer has to enter in a validation of who they are. This prompt can change depending on who the issuer is. In some cases, it could be a text that goes to your phone. In some situations, it could be biometric authentication or just a prompt from your issuer app on your device. But the point is that you as a consumer are validating who you are to the merchant, and then the merchant can reach out to a 3DS provider who then gets that confirmation from the issuer. 3 domains: consumer, merchant, and issuer are all agreeing. In a single PSP flow, the PSP and the 3DS provider are often the same. Not all the time, but it's often that the PSP is going to offer the 3DS services just as part of it. Maybe if you go to perform a transaction, then the PSP will prompt you to say, I need 3DS to perform this transaction. And so it won't accept it based off of jurisdiction or based off of the rules that you have on your account. This becomes more complicated in a multi-PSP setup, as we've talked about in other videos in the series. So if there are two PSPs, if there's PSP1 and there's PSP2, and this payment might go to either of them, then there's often a standalone 3DS provider. A 3DS provider is a service that is built specifically for the validation of the consumer. The service has integrations into the issuer layer and the required technology for the merchant to validate that consumer. What this means is that the merchant doesn't integrate into every issuer that exists. They just integrate into the 3DS provider. Frictionless and friction, why would you pick one or the other? So some jurisdictions require that you are always prompting the consumer to provide that information. And the issue there is it adds friction to the payment flow, which means a merchant, if you're relying on instinct purchases where it's an impulse buy, it's going to be more difficult because when they go to perform the payment, they're also going to get a second check to be like, are you sure you want to make this payment? And then they have to validate it. Whereas in the frictionless flow, it's all behind the scenes. So there's validation, although it's not explicit validation from the consumer. Let's go back to our North America versus Europe conversation. In North America, it is very uncommon to get that prompt, to get that challenge because they don't want to introduce friction into the flow. Whereas in Europe and in many other parts of the world, it is very normal to, when you're making an online purchase, that your issuer will prompt you to confirm that that is who you are. That is the friction, that is the challenge flow. What this means is that in North America, they are prioritizing the instinct purchase, which is the merchant's decision, and which is why they are taking on the liability for that payment. Whereas in Europe and in other places in the world, they are always asking the consumer if they want to make that payment so that they are confirming that the issuer can move money out of their account. What this means is the consumer has the liability, not the merchant. The common reasons for a merchant to do this are A, regulation. In Europe and in other places in the world, this is regulated, where the government is enforcing that they are validating consumers before a transaction happens. The other common one is for high value transactions. Let's say you are buying $5,000 worth of goods, $10,000 worth of goods. You don't want that to be wrong. And the merchant who's doing that does not want to take on the liability for that transaction. So they will perform this 3DS challenge auth, and it's very organic to the consumer, but really what it is the merchant saying like, this is not my fault if it's wrong. They're giving that liability back to the consumer.